When a narcissist's new relationship collapses, most people expect a predictable outcome. They assume the narcissist will simply move forward, find someone else, and repeat the same pattern with a new face. That assumption feels logical because it matches the surface behavior narcissists display so well. They appear to replace people quickly. They appear unaffected. They appear to keep going. But this is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings you can have about how a narcissistic system actually works. Because when the new supply fails, the narcissist does not move forward. They turn back. And the first person they need in that moment is not the new partner, not the most attractive option, and not the person they publicly showcased as proof that you were replaceable. The person they need is the one who once kept them psychologically stable, the one who unknowingly prevented their inner system from collapsing. This is where many people become confused and emotionally trapped. They mistake the narcissist's return as evidence of love, regret, or delayed realization. They believe the return means you mattered more than the new person, or they finally understand what they lost. But that interpretation keeps you stuck at the level of emotion, where nothing about a narcissist truly operates. What is happening has very little to do with love and almost everything to do with structure. A narcissist does not return because they miss you as a person. They return because something inside them has begun to fail. And when that failure begins, they do not search for what is new. They search for what is familiar, reliable, and already wired into their system. They search for the role that once regulated them. This is the truth that most people are never told. You were not simply a partner. You were not just someone they cared about. You were functioning as a psychological stabilizer. And the moment you understand that, the entire pattern begins to look very different. Their return is no longer flattering. It is no longer confusing. It becomes predictable. To see this clearly, you have to step out of the emotional narrative and into the underlying architecture of the narcissistic mind. Because what follows is not a story about romance. It is a story about dependence, collapse, and why the role you once held becomes most valuable at the exact moment you stop playing it. The most important shift you can make when trying to understand a narcissist's return is this. Stop asking what they felt and start asking what you did for their system. Because in a narcissistic structure, relationships are not primarily emotional bonds. They are regulatory mechanisms. People are not experienced as independent subjects with their own inner worlds. They are experienced as functions. When you were with a narcissist, you were not just present for the good moments. You were there in moments of instability, frustration, failure, shame, and emotional chaos. You absorbed moods that did not belong to you. You adjusted your behavior to avoid triggering reactions. You explained when things made no sense. You soothed when they were agitated. Over time, your nervous system learned how to move in rhythm with theirs. This was not accidental, and it was not mutual. It was conditioning. This is why the idea of replacement is deeply misleading. Being replaced does not mean you were removed from their internal system. It only means you were removed from the surface position. Internally, the role you played did not disappear. It was paused, stored, kept available, because from the narcissist's perspective, you were not simply a relationship that ended. You were a stabilizing function that could be reactivated when needed. This is also why their return often feels so disorienting. On the outside, it may appear sudden or contradictory. After devaluing you, denying you, or discarding you, they reappear as if the past never fully closed. But internally, nothing about this is sudden. The return happens at the exact moment when their current source of regulation fails, when the new supply can no longer maintain the illusion, when the persona begins to wobble, when the old emptiness resurfaces. At that point, the narcissist does not ask, "Who do I love?" They ask, unconsciously, "Where can I quickly regain stability?" And the answer is not found in someone new who requires effort, performance, and risk. It is found in the person whose reactions were once predictable, the person who once responded, the person who once held the emotional weight for them. This is the paradox that causes so much pain. The return does not mean you were valued more. It means you were useful in a deeper way. You occupied a position that went beneath attraction, beneath novelty, and beneath image. You were woven into the internal regulation of their psyche. That is why the return is driven by need, not desire, by dependence, not attachment. And this is where power begins to shift. Because the moment you stop performing that role, the old system cannot be restarted. When you no longer explain, soothe, react, or hold space for their emotional instability, the function they depended on is gone, not symbolically, structurally. That absence cannot be replaced easily, and it cannot be repaired by words. This is why understanding your role is not about self-blame. It is about clarity. You did not imagine the bond, but the bond was not what you thought it was. It was not love in the way you understood love. It was a system of regulation disguised as connection. And once you see that, the narcissist's return loses its power to confuse you. One of the most persistent misconceptions in narcissistic dynamics is the belief that the new supply fails because the new person is inadequate. This belief quietly protects the narcissist from scrutiny and redirects pain toward comparison. If the new person was simply not good enough, then the system itself remains unquestioned. But this explanation is false, and it keeps people trapped in self-blame and rivalry that has nothing to do with reality. The collapse of new supply does not originate in the behavior, intelligence, attractiveness, or emotional capacity of the new person. It originates in a structural limitation within the narcissistic psyche itself. New supply is placed into a role that can only function under very specific conditions: novelty, uncertainty, and idealization. When those conditions dissolve, the role collapses with them. In the beginning, new supply provides a powerful psychological effect. The narcissist feels desired, pursued, admired, and validated. Their persona expands. They appear confident, energized, and socially dominant. But this state is not rooted in connection. It is rooted in external mirroring. The new person reflects back an image that allows the narcissist to feel whole without ever integrating their inner emptiness. This is why the early stage feels so intense and convincing. However, this intensity carries a hidden weakness. It cannot survive familiarity. As soon as the relationship begins to stabilize, repetition enters the system. Daily life replaces fantasy. Predictability replaces projection. And with predictability comes something the narcissist cannot tolerate for long: the expectation of consistency. The new supply begins to notice patterns. They ask questions. They expect coherence between words and actions. In a healthy relationship, this is normal. In a narcissistic structure, it is perceived as pressure. Stability exposes what stimulation was hiding. As mirroring becomes less perfect, the narcissist's persona begins to weaken. The sense of specialness fades, and what resurfaces is not boredom, but the original void that existed long before the relationship began. This void is not consciously recognized. The narcissist does not think, "I am empty." Instead, they experience restlessness, irritation, dissatisfaction, and a vague sense of threat. Because the narcissistic psyche cannot tolerate internal responsibility for discomfort, these feelings must be externalized. The discomfort is assigned to the new person. Subtle devaluation begins. Small criticisms appear. Emotional withdrawal follows. The narcissist does not experience this as a choice. It feels like a necessary response to something that has changed, even though the change is internal. This is the moment many people misinterpret as loss of interest. In reality, it is loss of function. The new supply is no longer performing the psychological role required to keep the persona inflated. And because the narcissist does not relate to others as whole subjects, but as sources of regulation, the relationship rapidly deteriorates. There is no impulse toward repair, dialogue, or mutual growth. There is only the impulse to escape the discomfort. At this stage, the narcissist does not think about rebuilding connection. They think about relief. The relationship is not evaluated based on meaning or depth, but on efficiency. Is it still working? Is it still regulating? When the answer becomes no, detachment accelerates. Coldness, distancing, or disappearance emerge as reflexive defenses against confronting the inner void directly. This is why new supply does not gradually fade. It collapses. Once the illusion can no longer be sustained, the system loses coherence quickly. And it is precisely at this moment of collapse that the narcissist turns backward rather than forward. Not because the past was better, but because the past is familiar. The old system required less effort. The old role was already wired. Understanding this changes everything. New supply does not fail because the narcissist suddenly becomes bored or cruel. It fails because the structure cannot sustain continuous emotional presence. The narcissist lacks the capacity to remain bonded once stimulation fades. And when stimulation ends, the question that silently emerges is not, who do I want now, but where can I hide from this emptiness? That question never points toward someone entirely new. It points backward, toward the role that once absorbed the weight, stabilized the chaos, and allowed the narcissist to function without facing themselves. And that is why the collapse of new supply is not the end of the story. It is the trigger that reactivates the old map. Once you understand why new supply collapses, the narcissist's next move becomes easier to decode. The failure of the new relationship does not push them forward into something better. It pushes them into a moment of internal urgency. At that point, the narcissistic psyche is no longer driven by preference, attraction, or fantasy. It is driven by stabilization. And this is where the critical distinction appears between the person they want and the person they need. In a narcissistic structure, wanting and needing operate on separate psychological tracks. Wanting is tied to image and performance. It is about how things look, how they are perceived, and how effectively they reinforce the external narrative of superiority and desirability. Wanting thrives on novelty. It needs distance, uncertainty, and idealization to stay alive. This is the role new supply initially plays. It feeds the persona and keeps the illusion intact, but only as long as the system is not under pressure. Needing emerges when that illusion begins to fail. When stimulation fades and the inner void resurfaces, attraction loses its organizing power. The psyche shifts away from excitement and toward regulation. At this stage, the narcissist is not searching for someone impressive. They are searching for something reliable, someone whose presence once calmed the chaos rather than amplified it. This explains why the narcissist often returns to a person they previously devalued, dismissed, or replaced. From the outside, this appears contradictory or even humiliating. From the inside, it is efficient. The person they need is already familiar. The emotional rhythm is known. The responses are predictable. There is no need to build a new persona or sustain a new performance. The system can restart with minimal resistance. This is also why returning to a former primary supply requires far less psychological energy than securing an entirely new one. Attracting someone new demands coherence, charm, and emotional consistency at a time when the narcissist is already fragmented. It involves risk, exposure, and the possibility of rejection. Returning to someone who once functioned as a regulator bypasses all of that. Relief becomes immediate. Here is the point that is often misunderstood. When the narcissist comes back, it is not a reassessment of your value. It is an activation of your function. You are not being chosen over someone else. You are being accessed because you once occupied a position that stabilized the system when it was most vulnerable. This is why the return rarely carries curiosity or genuine interest in who you are now. The narcissist is not looking to meet your present self. They are looking to retrieve the version of you stored in their internal map. The one who responded. The one who explained. The one who absorbed emotional volatility without demanding accountability. They are not returning to a relationship. They are returning to a role. When this movement is mistaken for desire, people often reopen emotional access. They engage, clarify, or attempt to finally be understood. But desire is not what is active here. Necessity is. And necessity does not negotiate. It uses what is available until stability is restored or the source is exhausted once again. This is why any form of emotional engagement at this stage reinforces the old system. Even resistance, explanation, or refusal signals that the connection is still alive. The narcissist does not register boundaries as boundaries. They register them as interaction, as confirmation that the door has not fully closed. Understanding the difference between being wanted and being needed is what dismantles the illusion that keeps many people trapped. Being wanted flatters the ego. Being needed consumes the nervous system. One belongs to desire, the other belongs to dependence. And when you see clearly which one you were placed into, the narcissist's behavior stops feeling personal and starts revealing its true nature. A system seeking regulation, not a person seeking connection. Once the narcissist has identified who they need, the next question is not whether to return, but how. This is where hoovering begins. Hoovering is not an attempt to rebuild a relationship. It is an access test. The narcissist is not asking whether you still love them. They are asking, unconsciously, whether the old role is still available. This distinction is crucial. If you interpret hoovering as emotional outreach, you will respond emotionally. And the moment you respond emotionally, the test has already succeeded. Hoovering is not designed to persuade your logic. It is designed to activate your reflexes. The reflex to explain, the reflex to soothe, the reflex to restore harmony, the reflex you once used to keep the system stable. That is why hoovering rarely arrives as a clear apology or direct accountability. Those would require ownership and risk. Instead, it arrives as ambiguity, a neutral message, a practical excuse, a casual check-in that can be denied if rejected and expanded if welcomed. The content is intentionally vague because clarity would limit maneuverability. Ambiguity keeps the door flexible. At first, the signals often appear harmless. A question about logistics, a comment framed as maturity, a statement implying closure without actually closing anything. These openings are small by design. They are not meant to pull you back immediately. They are meant to see whether you will react at all. From the narcissist's perspective, reaction equals connection. If subtle probing produces a response, hoovering escalates. At this stage, the narcissist targets the trait that once bonded you most deeply, your empathy. They shift into victim narratives. They speak of confusion, pain, misunderstanding, or personal hardship. The story is not meant to be factual. It is meant to position you back into the role of interpreter, supporter, and emotional container. Another common escalation is the performance of change. Here, the narcissist mirrors exactly what you once wanted them to become. They reference insight, growth, self-awareness, even therapy. But the difference between change and hoovering is not found in language. It is found in timing and intention. Real change moves slowly and respects boundaries. Hoovering demands access before proof. When empathy and self-improvement narratives fail to generate engagement, nostalgia is often activated. Memories are selectively curated. Positive moments are highlighted while harm is erased. Nostalgia is not used to honor the past, but to pull you out of the present. It is an attempt to reactivate the emotional state in which you once waited, hoped, and forgave. If none of these strategies produce a response, hoovering may shift into crisis, an emergency, a sudden problem, a situation framed so that only you can help. This is not coincidence. Crisis bypasses reasoning and targets the caretaker instinct directly. The goal is not resolution. The goal is reaction. Because once you react, the old role reconnects instantly. What must be understood clearly is this. Hoovering is measured by response, not outcome. The narcissist does not need you to return fully. They only need confirmation that access still exists. Even refusal, explanation, or boundary setting can serve this purpose if it is emotionally charged. The content of your response is irrelevant. The fact that you responded is what matters. This is why hoovering never targets your logic. Logic does not regulate the narcissist. Reaction does. They are not listening for understanding. They are scanning for activation, for signs that the nervous system they once relied on is still responsive. This is also why hoovering often feels repetitive and strangely familiar. It follows the same emotional pathways that once kept you engaged. Not because the narcissist is creative, but because the system only knows one way to restore equilibrium. It reuses what worked before. Once you see hoovering for what it is, the illusion collapses. There is no hidden message. There is no deeper meaning to decode. There is only a system checking whether the old circuit is still live. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift decisively. Because the moment hoovering no longer produces reaction, something far more destabilizing than rejection occurs inside the narcissist. And that is what we need to understand next. The moment hoovering no longer produces a reaction, something ruptures inside the narcissistic system. This is not disappointment in the ordinary sense. And it is not grief, as emotionally healthy people experience loss. What occurs instead is narcissistic injury, a direct wound to an ego structure that depends on external mirroring to exist at all. For the narcissist, your silence is not interpreted as self-protection. It is interpreted as refusal, not a refusal of contact, but a refusal of power. Access to your emotions, attention, and nervous system once felt automatic. When that access is abruptly cut off, the narcissistic psyche has no internal framework to process it. The system was built on the assumption of response. When response disappears, coherence collapses. In a psychologically integrated person, rejection can activate reflection, sadness, or eventual acceptance. In a narcissistic structure, rejection does not lead inward. It produces existential threat. Without mirroring, the persona cannot hold its shape. The narcissist does not simply feel unwanted. They feel destabilized, disoriented, as if the ground that confirmed their existence has suddenly vanished. This is why the first reaction to your silence is often not calm withdrawal, but rage. Rage is not directed at you as a person. It is a desperate attempt to reassert control and restore equilibrium. It may appear as direct attacks, accusations, insults, or threats. It may also appear in colder forms, calculated silence, punishment through withdrawal, or strategic disappearance. The form varies, but the function is the same. Rage is an attempt to force reaction back into the system. When rage fails to restore access, the narcissistic psyche shifts into projection. The behaviors they are engaging in, intrusion, obsession, manipulation, are reassigned to you. Suddenly, you become the one who cannot let go, the one who is unstable, the one who is obsessed. Projection here is not simply lying. It is a defensive necessity. It protects the ego from admitting that power has been lost. At this stage, smear campaigns often re-emerge. Old stories are rewritten. Events are reframed. Context is erased. The purpose is not truth, but dominance. If the narcissist can no longer control you directly, they attempt to control how others perceive you. In the narcissistic inner world, being the negative center is preferable to being ignored entirely. What matters is remaining the reference point. What must be seen clearly is that none of these reactions are attempts at connection. They are attempts to convert silence into response. Silence is not experienced as emptiness. It is experienced as threat, a signal that the old system no longer functions. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the shadow erupts. The shame, helplessness, fear, and emptiness that were once externalized onto you can no longer be contained. With no external regulator available, these disowned elements flood inward. Narcissistic injury, therefore, is not only ego pain. It is a collision with an unintegrated shadow. Many people expect this moment to produce awakening or growth, but that expectation misunderstands the structure entirely. Injury does not produce maturity unless there is a stable self capable of integration. In the narcissist, that structure is absent. Instead of reflection, escalation occurs. More tactics, more intensity, or a rapid search for another source of mirroring to seal the fracture as quickly as possible. Here is the crucial reversal. Your silence does not weaken the narcissist because you become stronger. It destabilizes them because the anchor is gone. You do not need a final explanation, a perfect boundary statement, or moral closure. The absence of reaction is sufficient. It communicates one thing with absolute clarity. The old role is no longer available. At this point, The narcissist faces only two options. Either they locate another mirror to temporarily repair the persona, or they dig further into the past, searching for older sources of supply. And this reflexive movement leads directly into the final dynamic we must understand, the recycling loop, and why the cycle only truly ends when you are no longer inside it. After narcissistic injury, many people wait for something that never comes. They wait for remorse. They wait for insight. They wait for the moment the narcissist finally understands what they have done. But within a narcissistic structure, that moment does not arrive in the way emotionally integrated people expect. What follows injury is not awakening. It is recycling. The narcissist does not turn inward to rebuild a self that never fully formed. They turn outward to patch the persona as quickly as possible. And the fastest way to do that is not growth. It is reuse. Old supply. Familiar reactions. Known emotional circuits. The system does not innovate under threat. It repeats what once worked. This is the recycling loop. When access to you is blocked, the narcissist scans for the next easiest source of mirroring. Often, this is the most recently discarded supply. Someone still confused, still attached, still hoping. If that fails, the search moves further back in time. Former partners, dormant connections, people once devalued and dismissed. At this stage, standards visibly erode. What was once criticized becomes acceptable, not because values changed, but because urgency increased. Throughout this process, narratives are constantly rewritten. To some, you are portrayed as unstable, obsessive, unable to let go. To others, you are framed as a mistake from the past that has already been overcome. Each version is tailored to its audience. The purpose is not truth. It is control. Control of perception replaces control of connection. What must be understood clearly is this. No one in this loop is chosen. There is no winner. Each source of supply is retained only as long as they continue to provide sufficient reaction to stabilize the persona. When reaction diminishes, replacement follows. Not because of worth, but because this structure cannot sustain attachment. This is where many people misunderstand the narcissist's return one last time. They interpret it as proof of significance, as evidence that they mattered more than others. But the return proves something else entirely. It proves that you once occupied a position so structurally important that your absence exposed the fragility of the system. And this is where the true ending begins. The cycle does not end when the narcissist leaves. It does not end when they come back. It ends when you withdraw from the system altogether, when you no longer react, when you no longer explain, when you no longer offer emotional access in any form. This is not avoidance. It is disengagement from a role that was never meant to be yours. At that point, something irreversible happens. The narcissist may continue cycling elsewhere, but you are no longer part of the circuit. The old pathways no longer light up. The familiar buttons no longer work, not because you became cold, but because you became unavailable to be used as regulation. This is the shift from entanglement to sovereignty. You stop waiting for them to understand. You stop needing acknowledgement, apology, or collapse to validate your experience. Justice is no longer something you seek from their behavior. It is something you establish by where you stand. And that is the final truth this entire pattern leads to. The narcissist does not lose power because you confront them. They lose power because you are no longer inside the system that required confrontation in the first place. There is no dramatic victory here, no closure scene, no final conversation that seals the ending. There is only absence. And in that absence, the system that once fed on your reactions no longer knows how to reach you. That is not punishment. That is not revenge. That is the quiet, structural end. The moment when the cycle loses its hold, not because they changed, but because you did.